Good evening. I would like to welcome everyone to this live international webcast with Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Today is Sunday, March 24th, and we have called this webcast on an emergency basis because of the nature of the current international strategic crisis. Mrs. Zepp-LaRouche, as most of you are aware, is a leading German stateswoman. She is the founder and chairwoman of Germany's Buzo Party and also of the International Schiller Institute. My name is Dennis Small. I am the Ibero-American editor of Executive Intelligence Review magazine founded by Lyndon LaRouche. We are gathered here today in what is, in fact, an extremely dramatic week. Yesterday was March 23rd, the 30th anniversary of President Ronald Reagan's historic speech for the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which had been intellectually authored by Lyndon LaRouche, and which was then and remains today of absolute strategic importance to address the crisis facing humanity on the planet as a whole. We also are gathered today in the midst of a gigantic crisis which has been brought to people's attention because of events in Cyprus. Clearly not a crisis caused by Cyprus, but a crisis which has been exploded into public view by events there. This is unresolved at this moment. The world is at the brink of complete financial disintegration, and we face the requirements of both solving that economic and financial crisis and the unfinished business posed by Mr. LaRouche's Strategic Defense Initiative in terms of getting rid of the danger of war and establishing an entirely new paradigm for humanity. So with that, I would like to introduce to you Mrs. Zepp-LaRouche. She will speak to us today with introductory remarks, and we will then have a period of questions and answers, which I will present to her. If there are questions in the course of this webcast that you would like to send in, you may do so by email. And should any questions not be answered in the course of this discussion, they will be forwarded to Mrs. LaRouche for her to answer subsequently in written form, time permitting. So without further ado, Mrs. LaRouche.
Yes, in this moment, which is indeed a grave moment for not only the people of Cyprus, but actually, for the entire European nations, because the crisis in Cyprus could really trigger a disintegration of the entire euro. And to say it in the beginning, there would be a possibility to solve this in an orderly way. But unfortunately, as of now, it does not look as if the European governments, and especially the Troika, are seeking that solution. However, we want to present it so that people can actually have a perspective of how to overcome this crisis. Now, as of now, you have dramatic events in Brussels. There is a meeting taking place, probably as we speak now, between the Cyprus president, the leaders of the Cyprus parties, and the Troika, the European government heads. And as of now, what is being supposedly discussed is the size of the savings, which is to be protected, the possible winding up of the second largest bank of Cyprus, the Laiki Bank, which could lose, the depositors could lose up to 25% or much more of that. That, however, will all be debated when the parliament comes together after the president and the party leaders return from Brussels on Monday or Tuesday. But, no matter what the result is, this is not going to be stopped there. I just want to give you a couple of voices of people who are concerned in the situation. For example, the Archbishop Christostomos basically said the euro cannot last. It's not a question if it will disintegrate tomorrow, but we are not talking about a long-term duration of the euro. Therefore, it's best if people think about how to escape. Now, the Turkish Minister for the European Union, Bagis, offered in the meantime to use the Turkish lira as a transition. The Financial Times, in an article yesterday, reported that even in the Troika itself, there was a big dispute how to proceed. And this is typical when systems come down, that even in those who are running the system, there is no unity anymore, typical of a doomed system. Now, supposedly there was a fight between the IMF and Berlin, the Berlin government on the one side, who, in order to avoid a disaster as it just had been experienced in Greece, just wanted to create a good and a bad bank and hit the large depositors and spare those which have guaranteed accounts. On the other side of this dispute was the European Commission, Jörg Asmussen from the European Central Bank and Thomas Wieser, the Austrian finance minister, who were all worried that a hit on the large depositors would panic the investors and cause a run on the banks that way. Now, at one point, there was absolutely no locked situation. In any case, the situation then was continued, and they supposedly decided on the bank robbery plan, but fights continue. Now, an ex-Cyprus central banker, Orphanides, basically said the EU has decided to disintegrate. The European project is crashing to the earth. I would have expected the EU Commission and the European Central Bank to support the European project to protect the citizens of the smallest and weakest member of the states against discrimination. They have a cavalier attitude towards the expropriation of property and bullying the people. This all has made a mockery of the EU treaties and has demonstrated that not all people are equal under the law. Now, the Daily Telegraph yesterday noted that if they impose capital controls, which is very likely, to avoid massive capital flight out of Cyprus, that this measure alone is going to put an end to the euro because it will make the Cypriot euros into a national currency, because then the ability to get euros out of Cyprus is essentially over. It makes the Cyprus euro worthless, and the euro ceases to be a single currency. Now, I think it is important to take a look on how this thing was triggered. It was triggered by the very strange decision of the EU, the Troika, and especially the German government to impose a haircut on the small depositors of the Cyprus banks up to 6.75%, and the large depositors over 100,000 euro 9.9%. Now, they thought this would go through. They were completely surprised when they realized on the 19th of March that the Parliament of Cyprus unanimously voted against that. And, in a certain sense, this is now what you could really call the worst possible accident of what could have happened. Because, first of all, remember that in October 2008, after the collapse of Lehman Brothers and AIG, Chancellor Merkel had promised that in the Eurozone, all deposits up to 100,000 euro would be guaranteed by the state. Now, remember, that was a period where a lot of people thought the whole system is coming down. There was a panic for a certain period where people were talking about the reintroduction of a new Bretton Woods system. And Merkel's promise was a big contribution to prevent a banking run, to calm the situation. And, that promise now has been broken. Now, I don't quite understand why she did that, because, somebody must have known that this is now going to lead to enormous repercussions. Already, British politicians are advising, that all the pensioners, hundreds of thousands British pensioners who are living in Southern Europe, should as quickly as possible get their money out of the Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Greek banks as long as they can do that. Now, if you don't have a run immediately in these countries, there will be a tendency that people will try to save their money and try to get it out. And, if they go for capital controls in all of these countries now, then that is the end of the euro. It could be that somebody decided to pull the plug and trigger this, to impose a banking union, to impose a political union, and to impose a dictatorship in Europe. But this cannot function either, because already now, the whole European project, which was promised to be peace in Europe, to guarantee that there would be no war ever again, which was a complete propaganda line, because when the euro was introduced, there was no war danger in Europe at all. But it was basically portrayed as if that would make Europe strong against competitors of emerging market countries, China, Brazil, the United States. But if you look at it today, there has been never such a disunity among the countries of Europe since 1945, like the one caused by these policies of the EZB, the Troika, and the European governments. There has been more hostility, more tension, more horrible memories coming up from the past. So the Euro project is a failed experiment, and whoever thinks he can impose now a European dictatorship, you cannot use armies against millions of people. So I don't think that this is a very likable proposition. Now, within the logic of the system, naturally one can say that Germany cannot continue to be the main country to bail out this failed project, because after all, the German taxpayer ability to do this is limited. There are presently only 4 surplus countries: Germany, Holland, Finland, and Austria, who have a trade surplus and a balance surplus. All the others are de facto in a negative position, and Cyprus is already the 5th country to require a bailout, and naturally this has reached the end of the rope. Now, even without this present situation, the transatlantic financial system is completely finished. You had hyperinflationary quantitative easing going on in the United States. Ben Bernanke had given his name Helicopter Ben the true meaning, namely that he decided to throw banking notes out of helicopters over, whatever country and whatever bank was in need. So there is massive liquidity pumping going on in the United States. And when Mario Draghi a couple of months ago promised that he would do whatever it takes to save the euro, this meant that the EZB also was determined to print as much money, liquidity as possible, to buy up as many state bonds as possible. Now, so much for the famous last words, because obviously Draghi is not doing everything it takes to save the euro, because the case of Cyprus put an end to that. Now, this, however, is a big tragedy for the European people. Now, as I said, the euro is a failed experiment, and we are on the record that we said that before the euro was ever implemented. We said it when the idea of an imposed political European Monetary Union was proposed. It was clear that this could not function without a political union. And, well, at that time, this was the political price which Germany had to pay for the unification. And we should not forget that the euro came into being because Margaret Thatcher, François Mitterrand, and Bush Sr. Imposed it as the price for the German unification, that Germany should give up the D-Mark and that Germany should be contained in the corset of the Maastricht Treaty. And we at that point said it cannot function because the Eurozone was not a so-called optimal currency zone, because you had economies which were quite different. You had highly industrialized countries, you had agricultural countries, and especially you don't have one culture, you have many cultures, you have 17, or even in Europe you have 27 different cultures, nations, languages. So it was clear that this could not function. Now, Jacques Attali at the time, or a little bit later, had admitted in an interview that the euro was created deliberately with a birth defect, namely that it was clear it could not function, but a crisis would erupt, and then that crisis would be used to impose the political union, which was politically not accomplishable otherwise. Now, that is a danger, that some people may think to go in this direction, but I can see no circumstances how you can impose a dictatorship on a Europe which is divided as it is right now. Now, therefore, let's look at the solution. The problem is that the entire transatlantic financial system is bankrupt on top of the euro crisis. There is no way how you can remedy that by simply printing more money, because we are in a very close vicinity of the danger that what happened in Germany in 1923 would be repeated, except not only in one country like Germany then, but in the entire Eurozone, in the entire dollar zone, and from there to spread worldwide. Now, obviously, once people get a sense that hyperinflation is taking away their savings, and in a certain sense, hyperinflation so far has been moving slower by nibbling away the savings, the wages, the buying power. But if you would calculate what has been robbed from the real wages in the last years, you probably could come up with a figure much higher than the 6.75% theft from the little deposits from Cyprus, which were threatened, except it went gradually. And if you have now the effort to paper over this crisis by simply putting more liquidity in the system, this hyperinflation could explode more quickly than it exploded from the spring to the fall in 23. And when people realize that not only gasoline prices, electricity prices, food prices are going up, but that you would have a generalized hyperinflation, you are looking at the danger of a social chaos which makes the present tension look like a picnic. So there is only one solution. One has to recognize that the entire system of globalization is a failed business model. Now, Mr. Schäuble was all the time in the last days very quick to say that the Cyprus model is a failed business model, meaning, the big foreign investors putting money into Cyprus banks for tax reasons. But I can tell you that the system of globalization, as it was imposed after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the whole package, outsourcing, going into cheap labor markets, making, speculation the thing which was awarded, and punishing production. I mean, this whole system of globalization, of profit to the maximum, of money makes money, of neglecting real economy, that business model has failed. And it was clear it would fail because in 1989, when the wall had come down, I was saying in many speeches and articles that if one would make the mistake to impose on the bankrupt communist system the equal bankrupt system of the free market economy, maybe one could keep the process of looting for a couple of years, but then it would come to a collapse whereby the collapse of the communist system would look like peanuts. And now we are exactly at that point. Now there is a solution, and there is especially a historical precedent how we can get out of this. Now the historical precedent I'm talking about is what Franklin D. Roosevelt did in 1933, and the package of measures with which he ended the Depression in 1933. What he did is, first of all, he implemented GlassSteagall, the separation of the banks. He instituted a Pecora commission to investigate what crimes were committed by the banks in this crisis. Then he basically made the New Deal and thereby issued state credit to everybody who wanted to contribute to produce useful things, including the famous Tennessee Valley Authority infrastructure project. And within a very short period of time, the US economy was booming. And as everybody knows, by the end of the Second World War, the US economy was the strongest economy in the world. Now, that model was replicated by the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau in the period of the reconstruction of the German economy after 1945, which was modeled on Roosevelt's Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And as everybody knows, it led within a few years, to the German economic miracle admired by the whole world. Now, therefore, there is a solution, but this solution has to start with GlassSteagall. In the recent period, there was a lot discussion about separation of the banks. Now, I'm proud to say that our organization was probably the most instrumental to not only revive GlassSteagall in the United States, but also to get that debate going in Europe. Because 2-3 years ago, if you would have asked somebody what is a separation of the bank, GlassSteagall, people would know. And in the meantime, you have all kinds of watered-down proposals. Liikanen Commission, the ring fencing proposal of the Vickers Commission, you have the Volcker rule. All of these leave loopholes for the continued speculation of the banks, which are as big as barns, barn doors. So these don't function. What we need to do is go back to the original GlassSteagall as Roosevelt designed it. Now, in a first step, that means that the state has to protect the commercial banks, because these commercial banks are necessary to maintain the economy, to maintain the real economy, pensions, wages, trade, commerce. And then basically the investment banks have to be separated from that. And they from now on have to take care of their affairs without bailout packages. If they have problems, sorry, they have to clear their books. If they are bankrupt, well, then they have to declare insolvency. But it must stop that continuously bailouts using state budgets, using taxpayer money, is being misused to enable these banks to continue the high-risk speculation, because this is exactly what has happened after 2008. Today, the situation is worse than before Lehman Brothers, and it's worse because the states have so far done nothing to prevent the high-risk speculation. That must stop. We must declare GlassSteagall and probably toxic money in the investment banks by the trillions has to just be written off. Now, people are screaming about that because they say, oh, I have these creative financial instruments and this is on my bank and so forth. But this is only virtual money. And, if you're losing something virtual, you're really losing nothing. So that will be the first step. Then, however, after all the countries of the United States, and by the way, there is a big motion right now in the United States to implement GlassSteagall in the Congress, in the Senate, among the state legislators, but also in all European countries, we need to do that. That is only the first step. After we have done that, it will turn out that the amount of liquidity is not sufficient to maintain the economy because you write off all of this toxic waste. At that point, you need the implementation of a credit system, which means that you have to have national banks in each country who provide credit lines for real production. And these credit lines have to be limited to well-defined projects which have basically a function to contribute to the increase of the productivity of the economy. They have to be in the common good. They have to be organized according to the principle of physical economy. Now, for example, the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau in Germany after 1945 was such a national bank. At that point, it did fulfill such a function. And something like that could be the model for such a bank in every country. The next step is naturally you need to go back to the sovereign control of the national currencies. Now, this is relatively easy. For example, at the Hamburg Bundeswehr University already some years ago, a study was made how one could go from the euro back to the D-mark. And the professor who did that study came to the conclusion that it is relatively easy because, first of all, we have the experience of the D-mark to euro transition, and we just would do it in reverse. We could keep the existing euros as a kind of ECU, a European Accounting unit for the time being. But then we would start to issue national currencies and have sovereignty about the own currency and the own economy in every country. That means we also need fixed exchange rates to prevent currency speculation. Mr. Soros has no business in continuing to do this. And then we need to adopt a well thought out program to get the real economy going. Now, we have worked on such a program already almost a year ago, and we have produced this study. It's called There is a Life After the Euro, Program for an Economic Miracle in Southern Europe, the Mediterranean, and Africa. And you can go to our website and you find all the details about it, but let me explain it shortly. Now, this program basically goes from the assumption that we have right now between the countries of Eurasia a development of the Eurasian land bridge with the potential to become the world land bridge. That is to connect the different continents through infrastructure corridors. For example, it includes the building of the Bering Strait, which is not on this map, combining Alaska and Siberia. It includes vast projects between China and Russia, Korea, Japan. It goes all the way to Chile. And this has been our proposal following the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it's being implemented now in step by step. Now, our program for the development of Southern Europe basically has the idea to connect Europe in a deep way with this world land bridge. Now, a big part of this program is to revive 10 EU transport corridors, which were adopted by a conference of the EU transport ministers at a conference in 1994 in Cyprus, which declared 10 transport corridors to be the priority projects. I think 5 of them go into the Balkans, others into Italy, others into the Iberian Peninsula. And these are plans which are ready. They have not been implemented, almost not at all, because of the austerity policy of the Troika. But these are projects which could start tomorrow. So you could issue credit lines to invest in this railway water system infrastructure project in Southern Europe. We have upgraded this program through other avant-garde projects like building a tunnel, not only building the bridge of Messina between Italy and Sicily, but also a tunnel from Sicily to Tunisia. It includes a tunnel under the Strait of Gibraltar connecting Spain with Africa. This has been done as a feasibility study already 3 or 4 years ago. It has been basically approved and then it was cut. So that could start tomorrow. We want to increase science centers in the Canary Islands in essence, because you need to have an attraction to stop the brain drain of young people who have fled the unemployment of Spain, Greece, Portugal, and who are now immigrating to Germany or some other countries. You have to attract them to come back. And you have to make a definite plan so that the economic construction of the real economy of the Balkans, of Greece, of southern Italy, of the Iberian Peninsula, of the Mediterranean, and naturally also the Middle East, where we have worked out a whole separate program, which is being discussed in many countries right now, and a development plan for Africa. Now, this can be done, and it must be done. I mean, the only way to stop a collapse of civilization in Europe and beyond is to change the course, to recognize that the globalization is a failed business model, that it cannot be maintained, and that we have to put a real program for a future, for a vision, how to get Europe out of this present crisis on the agenda. Now, I think it can be done, but, as I said, as of now, I'm absolutely sure that in Brussels, they're discussing the failed business model. And therefore, I'm calling on people in all of the affected countries of Europe to contact us, get more information about this program, and help us to create a growing lobby to implement it.